The day Eliza Doyle rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a borrowed mule with 40 cents in her pocket and a carpetbag tied to the saddle with twine, she had no idea the town would decide within 48 hours that she was the most dangerous woman they had ever seen. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of civilization, a cattle town that smelled of longhorn and ambition and sun-baked earth. The main street was wide enough to turn a full wagon team around, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned against each other like tired men after a long drive. There was a general store, a barber, a land office, a saloon called the Prairie, a small white church that needed painting, and a sheriff's office with a crooked sign. It was not a beautiful town, but it was alive with the particular energy of a place that believed itself to be on the edge of becoming something. Eliza was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept in a practical braid, green eyes that noticed everything, and the kind of face that was not merely pretty but interesting, a face with a history in it. She had come from Wichita, where she had spent 3 years working as a seamstress and a schoolteacher's assistant, and before that from a small farm outside of Abilene that no longer existed because her father had drunk it into foreclosure the year she turned 20. She had no family left to speak of and no real plan beyond finding work in a town that needed someone who could sew, teach letters, or keep accounts. She pulled her mule to a stop in front of the general store and climbed down stiffly, rolling her shoulders and squinting at the street. A pair of cowboys sat on the porch of the Prairie across the way, watching her with mild curiosity. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the millinery shop paused to stare. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Hiram Potts, came out to stand in his doorway with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. "Morning," Eliza said pleasantly. "I'm looking for whoever handles employment in this town. I'm a seamstress and I have some teaching experience. I would also take bookkeeping work if there is any." Hiram Potts looked her over the way a man looks at a bill of sale he does not quite trust. "You alone?" "I am. No husband, he grunted. "You might try the church. Reverend Aldous keeps a community board, or the hotel they might need a laundress." It was not a warm welcome, but it was not hostile either, and Eliza thanked him and led her mule toward the small livery stable at the end of the street. She found the hotel, a 2-story frame building called the Cattlemen's Rest, and secured a room for 3 nights using most of her 40 cents, which left her with 7 cents and a growing awareness that she needed to find work immediately. The first day went well enough. She visited the church, where Reverend Aldous, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, told her that the town had indeed been without a schoolteacher since January, when the previous one had married a cattle buyer and moved to Dodge City. He was cautiously encouraging. He said the school board would need to vote on any appointment, but that he thought it could happen within the week if she could demonstrate her qualifications. He would arrange a meeting. She also visited the seamstress shop, which was run by a widow named Mabel Greer, who was in her 50s and arthritic in her hands and badly in need of someone who could do fine work. Mabel hired her on the spot for $3 a week, which was not a fortune but would keep her in the hotel room and fed while the school board deliberated. So the first day in Caldwell, Eliza went to sleep feeling tentatively hopeful. The trouble began on the second day, and it began because of Cora Blanchard. Cora Blanchard was 38 years old, the wife of Gerald Blanchard, who owned the largest cattle operation south of Caldwell and was also the head of the town council. Gerald was a soft-spoken man who did whatever Cora told him to, a fact that everyone in Caldwell understood but nobody said aloud. Cora was the kind of woman who ran a town without holding any official position, who knew everything about everyone, and who had decided long ago that Caldwell was hers to manage as she saw fit. She had heard about Eliza before Eliza finished her first morning in town, because Cora Blanchard heard about everything. She had made discreet inquiries. She had sent a wire to Wichita, And by the afternoon of Eliza's second day, Cora was holding a response that she had not expected, and that changed the nature of everything. The wire from Wichita said that Eliza Doyle had been dismissed from her position as a schoolteacher's assistant 8 months ago, following a complaint from a parent who alleged that she had been teaching the colored children who worked on a nearby farm to read and write in her private hours, and that she had done so without the sanction of the school board, and that the parent in question had demanded her removal. This was true. Every word of it was true. Eliza had indeed been teaching 3 children, the sons and daughter of a freedman named Thomas Reeves, who sharecropped a farm east of Wichita, to read and write in the evenings after her regular duties were done. She had done it because they were bright children who deserved a chance, and because no school in the county would admit them, and because she believed that refusing to teach a child because of the color of their skin was a moral wrong that she was unwilling to participate in by her silence. She had been dismissed and quietly asked to leave Wichita, which was how she had ended up on a borrowed mule heading south. Cora Blanchard read that wire with a tight little smile and went directly to her husband, who went directly to the sheriff, who was a man named Dale Pratt. Sheriff Pratt was not a bad man exactly, but he was a practical one who understood that his position depended on the goodwill of Gerald Blanchard, who depended on the goodwill of Cora. By the evening of Eliza's second day, Sheriff Pratt came to her room at the Cattleman's Rest and knocked on the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was somewhere between embarrassed and determined. "Miss Doyle," he said when she opened the door, "I am going to have to ask you to move on. Town council decision. You have got 3 days to settle your affairs and leave Caldwell." Eliza stared at him. She had heard the words, but they did not immediately arrange themselves into meaning. "I beg your pardon. 3 days, Miss Doyle. I am sorry for it, but the council has voted and I have to carry out their decision." "On what grounds?" she asked, and her voice was very calm, which surprised her because there was a storm starting somewhere in her chest. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He turned his hat around in his hands. "Conduct unbecoming," he said, "and disruption of community standards. Those are not charges, Sheriff. Those are opinions dressed up as charges." "Yes, ma'am." "But the council has the authority to determine who may take up permanent residence in an incorporated township under Kansas law, Section 42 of the Municipal Charter, and they have exercised that authority." She recognized in this moment the particular helplessness of being right and powerless at the same time. She had been right in Wichita, too. Being right had not saved her there either. 3 days, she said. 3 days, ma'am. I am sorry." He left, and Eliza stood in the middle of her small room with the oil lamp throwing shadows on the wall and thought about what she was going to do. She had 7 cents. She had nowhere to go. She had a mule that was not hers and would need to be returned, which would leave her without transportation. The nearest town was 12 miles in any direction across open prairie. She went to see Mabel Greer that evening and told her what had happened. Mabel's face crumpled with something that looked like shame. "I heard," the older woman said. "I heard this afternoon. I want you to know that I do not agree with it." "Can you speak to the council?" Mabel shook her head slowly. "Gerald Blanchard's wife decides who gets to work in this town, and if I push against her, I will lose my lease. She owns this building. She owns most of the buildings on this street." She pressed some coins into Eliza's hand, more than a week's pay in advance. "Take this. I wish I could do more." Eliza walked back to the hotel in the dark and counted the money. Enough to get somewhere, maybe. But where? And what then? She did not sleep well that night. The morning of the 3rd day, the first of her 3 given days, not the last, she woke early and went to the church to find Reverend Aldous, because she was not a woman who sat still in a difficulty. She presented her case to him clearly and without embellishment. She had taught children to read. She had been dismissed for it. She had come to Caldwell in good faith seeking honest work, and she was being expelled for nothing more than her history of decency. The Reverend listened with his hands folded on his Bible, and she could see him weighing things. He was a decent man, she thought, but he was also a man who lived inside the same structures that Cora Blanchard commanded. "I will speak at the council meeting on Friday," he said finally. "I cannot promise it will change anything." "Friday is after my 3 days," Eliza said. He looked pained. "I know, I am sorry." She left the church in the bright morning light, stood on the boardwalk, and looked down the length of the main street of Caldwell. The town was waking up. A delivery wagon was being unloaded in front of the general store. 2 men on horseback were heading south, probably toward one of the cattle operations that lay beyond the town limits. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the hotel kitchen. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in a perfectly ordinary cattle town, and it had decided she was not welcome. She was thinking about this, about where she might go and how she might get there, when she noticed the man standing outside the land office. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance of it, broad shoulders that pulled his canvas work jacket tight across the back, long legs in dusty denim trousers, worn boots that had seen years of use. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two older, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that needed a shave. He was reading something posted in the window of the land office, and there was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance except for the fact that he looked, in some quality she could not immediately name, like a man who made his own decisions. He turned then as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met across the width of the street. His eyes were dark, the color of good earth after rain, and he looked at her for a moment with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely unhidden. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a slight and genuine acknowledgement, and went back to reading whatever was posted in the window. Eliza turned away and went back toward the hotel. She had other things to think about. She spent the morning at Mabel's shop finishing a dress she had started the day before, because she believed in finishing what she started, and because she did not know what else to do with her hands. She worked steadily and well, and Mabel made coffee and they talked about small things, avoiding the large one. Around midday the door to the shop opened and a voice said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Greer. I heard you had taken on a new seamstress." Eliza looked up from her sewing. It was the man from the street. He was holding his hat in his hands, and he looked, she thought, slightly out of place in a seamstress shop, the way a good horse looks slightly out of place in a parlor, not wrong exactly, just undeniably more suited to open spaces. "Jeremiah Garrett," Mabel said warmly, rising to shake his hand. "I have not seen you in town for 2 weeks. How is the ranch?" "Coming along," he said. He glanced at Eliza. "Ma'am, Mr. Garrett," she said carefully. "Jeremiah, this is Eliza Doyle," Mabel said, and there was something in her voice that Eliza could not quite interpret, a certain deliberateness. "She has been helping me this week. She is a fine seamstress and a schoolteacher besides." "I heard there was a new person in town," Jeremiah said. He was still looking at Eliza, but his expression was careful, measuring but not unkind. "I also heard what the council decided." A silence settled over the room. Eliza put her sewing down on her lap. "Did you?" "I did." He turned his hat once around in his hands. "I want you to know that not everyone in Caldwell agrees with it." "That is kind," she said, keeping her voice even. "But it does not change the fact that I have been given 3 days to leave." "No," he agreed. "It does not change the fact, but facts can sometimes be rearranged." He glanced at Mabel, who was watching this exchange with her arthritic hands folded very still in her lap and an expression of careful attention on her face. "I have a ranch about a mile east of town, the Garrett place. My housekeeper left in February to go live with her daughter in Topeka, and I have been managing without one since. I need someone who can keep accounts, which I am told you can do, and who can handle the household books, and I could use someone who knows something about practical medicine and illness, since I have 3 ranch hands and no doctor within 15 miles. Eliza looked at him very steadily. "You are offering me work." "I am offering you a position. It would include room and board and wages. It would be a legitimate employment arrangement." He met her eyes without wavering. And if you are employed on a private ranch that lies on the edge of town's jurisdiction, the town council has considerably less authority over your daily movements than they do over a resident of the hotel. The clarity of this fell over Eliza like cold water. She understood immediately what he was doing and why, or at least the practical dimension of it. He was offering her a way around the council's decision, not a reversal of it, but a workaround. A legal workaround that would require Cora Blanchard and Gerald Blanchard and Sheriff Pratt to do considerably more work if they wanted to pursue the matter further. Why? She asked, because she was a direct person and the question needed to be asked. He did not look away. Because what they did is wrong, he said simply. Because you came here looking for honest work, and they ran you out for a reason that does not hold up to any serious examination. Because I happen to need a housekeeper, and you happen to need a position. And it seems to me like those two facts ought to count for more than Cora Blanchard's opinion of who should be allowed to stay in Caldwell. It was a good answer. It was honest without being dramatic, and it left room for her to make her own decision without feeling rescued in a way that would diminish her. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the alternative, which was the road out of Caldwell with 7 cents and no clear destination. She thought about the Reverend's Friday meeting that would come too late. She thought about Mabel's coins pressed into her hand with helpless sympathy. I will need to know the exact terms, she said. Wages, duties, and what is expected of me. I will also need it understood from the beginning that my position is that of a hired professional, not something else. Something in his expression shifted slightly, and she thought she caught the edge of a smile, though it did not quite fully form. Those are entirely reasonable terms. I would not expect anything less. Then I will come see the ranch this afternoon, Eliza said, and if the terms are satisfactory, I will accept the position. I will be there, he said. He put his hat back on. Good day, Mrs. Greer, Miss Doyle. When he left, Mabel let out a long, slow breath and pressed both hands flat on the arms of her chair. Jeremiah Garrett is the finest man in this county, she said, and possibly the stubbornest, and he has never in 10 years done anything without thinking it through 6 ways first. Do you trust him? Eliza asked. With my life, Mabel said without hesitation. And that is not a statement I make about many people. Eliza looked at the door where he had just left. Then I will go see his ranch. She rode out that afternoon on her borrowed mule, following Mabel's directions east along the road that curved away from town and into open prairie. The sky was enormous and very blue, scattered with high white clouds that cast moving shadows across the grass. It was the kind of sky that made you feel very small but not unhappily so, just accurately placed in the order of things. The Garrett Ranch appeared first as a windmill turning in the distance, then as a cluster of buildings that resolved as she drew closer into a main house, a long barn, a bunkhouse, a corral, and several outbuildings. The house was not grand, but it was solid, built of frame lumber with a wide porch running across the front and a stone chimney at one end. Someone had planted a few cottonwood saplings along the south side, probably years ago, because they were now tall enough to provide shade in the afternoon. Jeremiah Garrett came out of the barn when he heard her approach, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked different out here, she thought, in a way she could not immediately articulate. He looked like he belonged here. The ranch wore him the way good land wears a man who understands it. He showed her around with the brief and purposeful manner of someone who does not waste words on people he thinks will not understand them, and she understood almost immediately that this was a kind of respect. He was showing her the actual operation, the books he kept, which were neat but not sophisticated and could stand real improvement, the store of supplies in the larder, the state of the small vegetable garden behind the house that had been left to struggle along without attention since February, the medical kit that contained good basic supplies but was poorly organized. He showed her the bunkhouse where his 3 ranch hands lived and introduced her to them. A taciturn older man named Walt who had ridden with trail crews for 20 years, a young Mexican man named Rodrigo who had come up from Texas the previous year, and a steady-handed man named Pete who was missing 2 fingers from his left hand from a roping accident but was otherwise fully capable. They were polite to her, all 3, in the way of men who have been told to be polite. They discussed terms on the porch as the afternoon light went golden and long. He offered her $5 a week plus room and board, with Sundays free, and no expectation of anything beyond the specific duties they listed. She negotiated up to $5.50 on the grounds that she was also bringing bookkeeping skills that would save him from the occasional mistakes she had already spotted in his ledgers, and he agreed without much argument, which told her that he had probably intended to pay that all along. She accepted the position. They shook hands on it, which surprised him slightly, she could see, but he recovered quickly and shook her hand firmly. She went back to town to collect her carpetbag and return the borrowed mule to its owner, a widow named June Hartley who lived at the north end of town, and who had lent it without expectation of return, except when it was convenient. Eliza settled the debt of the mule's use with 3 of Mabel's coins, and walked back out to the ranch with her bag over her shoulder in the early evening, because she did not have the price of another night in the hotel, and did not intend to spend it anyway. She arrived at the Garrett Ranch as the stars were beginning to show in the eastern sky, and Jeremiah Garrett was on the porch with a cup of coffee, and there was a lamp burning in the window of the room he had prepared for her. That first night on the ranch was quiet and strange, and not uncomfortable. She lay in the narrow bed in the clean small room that smelled of pine wood and old wool, and listened to the night sounds of the prairie coyotes in the distance, the horses shifting in the barn, the wind in the cottonwoods, and felt, for the first time since arriving in Caldwell, that the ground under her had some solidity to it. The next 2 days were busy in the particular focused way of new work. She set about learning the household with the same methodical energy she brought to everything. The kitchen needed reorganizing, which she did carefully, and with an eye toward efficiency. The larder inventory was incomplete, which she corrected. She found his account books, 2 years of them, and spent an entire morning going through them. And while his basic arithmetic was sound, his categorization was a mess, and she set about restructuring them in a way that would tell him, at a glance, exactly where the ranch stood financially. She planted the vegetable garden properly, irrigating from the pump, and went through the medical kit and reorganized it and made a list of what needed to be replenished. Jeremiah watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read, but was not displeasure. He was away for much of those 2 days managing cattle with his ranch hands, but he came in for meals and they sat at the kitchen table together in the evenings and talked about the ranch, about what it needed and what was working, and she found that he listened when she spoke, actually listened, which was rarer than she had come to expect. On the 3rd morning, which was the last of the 3 days the town had given her to leave, Sheriff Pratt appeared on horseback at the gate of the ranch. Eliza was in the garden when she heard him arrive, and she stood and wiped her hands on her apron and watched as Jeremiah came out of the barn to meet him. She could not hear the conversation at first. She walked closer, not hiding it, just walking steadily toward the fence because she was not a woman who hid when her situation was being discussed. The council gave her 3 days, the sheriff was saying as she came within earshot. Those 3 days are up this morning. Miss Doyle is employed at this ranch, Jeremiah said. His voice was level and without particular aggression, just matter of fact, the way a man states a thing that is not in dispute. She has been so since 2 days ago. Her employment and her residence here are private matters on private property that lies outside the town's incorporation boundary. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Mr. Garrett, I have instructions from the council to Sheriff Pratt, Jeremiah said, and now there was a quality in his voice that was different, still calm but very definite, the way a good fence is definite, quiet, and immovable. I want to be clear with you, because I respect you as a man doing a difficult job. Miss Doyle has broken no law. She committed no crime in Wichita and she has committed none here. The town council voted to expel her because she taught children to read without regard for the color of their skin, and that is not a legal cause for expulsion. It is a personal opinion dressed in official clothing. She is employed here, she is residing here, and she is staying here. If the council wants to pursue this further, I would suggest they speak to a lawyer first, because I will speak to one too. The sheriff sat on his horse for a long moment. He looked at Eliza, who met his gaze calmly. He looked back at Jeremiah. The council is not going to like this, he said finally. I know that, Jeremiah said. Good day, Sheriff. There was another pause, and then Dale Pratt turned his horse and rode back toward town. Eliza stood there in the morning sunlight with her apron still in her hands and watched him go. Jeremiah turned to look at her. There was something in his expression she could not quite name, not triumph, nothing as cheap as that, but a kind of resolved steadiness, as if this was simply a thing that had needed doing and had now been done. That may not be the end of it, she said. No, he agreed, it probably is not. Thank you, she said. Not for the first time, and I suspect not for the last. Something crossed his face then, very briefly, that looked almost like uncertainty. You would have found another way, he said. You are not the kind of person who runs out of options. She looked at him for a moment. How do you know what kind of person I am? You have known me for 3 days. Long enough, he said, and turned back toward the barn. She stood there a little longer, watching where he had gone, and felt something she had not expected, not quite gratitude anymore, but something more complicated and more interesting. The council's response came not as a legal challenge but as a social one, which was in some ways more insidious. Word spread through Caldwell that Eliza Doyle was living at the Garrett Ranch, unchaperoned and unmarried, and Cora Blanchard made sure that interpretation of this fact spread with the word. The implication was exactly what Cora intended it to be, that Eliza was a woman of loose character, and that Jeremiah Garrett had simply installed her in his house for reasons that had nothing to do with bookkeeping. Eliza heard about this within a week through Mabel, who rode out to the ranch one afternoon on the pretext of delivering a sewing commission, and actually to warn her friend. Eliza's first reaction was anger, clean and hot. Her second reaction, after she had sat with it for a while, was a kind of tired recognition. This was how it always worked. When you could not punish a woman for what she had actually done, you punished her for what you could imply about her. It was very old and it was very effective, and she hated it. She told Jeremiah that evening at supper, not because she thought he did not know, but because it needed to be acknowledged between them. He set down his fork and was quiet for a moment. I am sorry, he said. That is my fault. I did not think far enough ahead about what they would do. It is not your fault, she said. The fault belongs to the people spreading the rumor. That is true and also somewhat idealistic, he said, which surprised her. It was the kind of frank, slightly wry response she had not expected from him, and she found she liked it very much. The practical question is what we do about it. What can we do about it, she asked. We cannot make people think what we want them to think. No, he said, but we can give them less room to speculate. He was looking at the table now rather than at her, which was unusual for him because he was generally a man who looked directly at what he was talking about. If it would be agreeable to you, I could ask Mabel to come stay for a while, as a sort of presence. It would take the edge off the speculation. She considered this. It was a practical solution, and it was also, she recognized with some amusement, the solution of a man who was somewhat uncomfortable with the situation he had created by being a decent person. That would help, she said, though I will tell you plainly that I am less concerned with my reputation than with the effectiveness of my position here. If people think badly of me, I can live with that. What I cannot live with is if their thinking badly of me gives Cora Blanchard another tool to use. He looked up at her then. That is a very practical way to look at it. I am a practical person. Yes, he said, I know. Mabel did come to stay for a while, and it helped, and life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that Eliza found, to her slight surprise, deeply satisfying. The work was real and meaningful. The ranch under her management became more organized, more efficient. She found a system for the accounts that allowed Jeremiah to see at a glance his actual margins on the cattle operation. And when she showed him that he was losing money on one of his 2 grazing leases because the grass quality was too low for the per-head return, he listened carefully and made adjustments that would save him several $100s over the season. The garden came in green and productive in May, and she found real pleasure in it that surprised her. She had not gardened much before and had not known she would love it. She and Jeremiah fell into a habit of talking in the evenings on the porch after supper, when the work was done, and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and the prairie settled into its nighttime sounds. They talked about all manner of things, the ranch, yes, but also bigger things. Books they had read, the state of the country, which was still working through the long, complicated aftermath of the war that had ended 13 years ago. The question of what was owed to people who had been wronged by the machinery of a nation that claimed to believe in something better than it had ever managed to practice. Jeremiah had opinions about these things that were not simple or easy, and she found that she liked this, that he thought carefully and held things with some complexity, and was willing to change his mind when confronted with something he had not considered. He had grown up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who had come west before the war, and he had built this ranch himself with money borrowed from a bank in Topeka and paid back over 7 years of extremely hard work. He was proud of it in the way of someone who knows exactly what a thing cost them. She learned about him slowly, in the way you learn about a place, not all at once but by accumulation, a detail here, a story there, a quality revealed by a particular circumstance. She learned that he was patient with animals in a way that was almost extraordinary, that he could gentle a frightened horse by sheer calm presence, and that he had the same quality with people in difficulty. She learned that he had once, at the age of 22, ridden 50 miles in a February blizzard to get a doctor for a neighbor's wife who was in danger from a difficult birth, and that both the woman and the child had survived, and that he had never once mentioned this fact himself. She learned it from Walt, who had been there. She learned that he gave Rodrigo time off to attend the Mexican church in a town 20 miles south, and that he had defended Rodrigo's right to do so against the objections of Pete, who was suspicious of Mexicans in a casual and thoughtless way, until Pete had been obliged to either adjust his thinking or find work elsewhere, and he had adjusted his thinking. What she was slower to learn or slower to admit she was learning was how she felt about him. It began as respect. She was absolutely clear about that. She respected him enormously, more than she had respected most people she had known, because his decency was not the performed kind but the structural kind, built into how he moved through the world. But respect, she began to notice, was only the foundation. There was something else accumulating on top of it, something she first noticed one evening in late May when she was sitting on the porch reading, and he came out to sit in the chair beside her and said nothing, just sat there with his own quietness and the last of the evening light, and she felt something in her chest that was warm and specific and had nothing to do with gratitude or respect. She did not examine it immediately. She was not, as she reminded herself firmly, in Caldwell for a romance. She was there for work, and for the stability that had eluded her since her father's farm had been lost. Getting complicated feelings for the man who employed her was precisely the kind of thing she could not afford, but the feeling did not care about what she could afford. June came in warm and busy. A pair of calves were born and needed attention. A section of the north fence blew down in a windstorm and had to be rebuilt. The garden needed constant work as the heat intensified. Walt came down with a fever that scared everyone for 3 days, and it was Eliza who sat with him, keeping his temperature down with cool cloths and making him drink the willow bark tea she brewed from the supply she had added to the medical kit, and who was there when the fever broke on the 4th morning, and he looked up at her with exhausted eyes and said, "I thought I was done." "Not today," she had told him, and managed to keep her voice steady despite the wave of relief that had gone through her. Jeremiah had been in and out of the bunkhouse constantly during those 3 days, more worried than he showed, and when the crisis passed, he came to find her in the kitchen afterward, where she was finally sitting down with a cup of coffee and the particular hollow feeling of exhaustion and relief combined. He sat down across from her and said, "Thank you," in a voice that had nothing performed about it. "He would have been all right regardless," she said. "The fever was already breaking." "Maybe," he said, "but you were there." He looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel like he was seeing something more than the surface of things. "You are good at taking care of people." "Someone has to," she said, meaning it lightly, but he did not take it lightly. "Not everyone thinks so," he said. "Most people take care of themselves and call it enough." She thought about Thomas Reeves's children then, the reason she had been dismissed from Wichita. "I learned a long time ago," she said slowly, "that the world does not get better by itself. It gets better because someone decides to make it better, usually at some cost to themselves. I decided I was not willing to let the cost be the reason." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That is the clearest thing I have ever heard anyone say about that." She looked at him, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet. "Jeremiah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of the title, and they both noticed it. She felt heat come into her face. "I am going to check on Walt." She got up and left the kitchen, and she could feel his eyes following her, and she did not look back. The shift after that evening was subtle but unmistakable, at least to her. She was hyper-aware of him in a way that was both pleasant and inconvenient, aware of where he was in a room, of the particular way he laughed, which was quiet and genuine and happened rarely, but when it did, it changed the quality of the air around it. She was aware of the width of his shoulders and the care of his hands, which were workers' hands, scarred and strong, but which handled small fragile things, a day-old calf, a cracked tool, a frightened barn cat, with precision and gentleness. She did not know what he felt. He was not a man who declared himself easily, and she had no way of reading his interior life from the outside except in small things, and the small things were not conclusive. He was kind to her. He listened to her. He treated her as an intelligent person whose opinions mattered, which was not nothing in the year of 1878. But kindness and respect were not love, and she was not going to mistake one for the other. In July, Cora Blanchard escalated. Eliza had begun, carefully and informally, to teach reading to Rodrigo, who had expressed a desire to learn English letters more thoroughly than he had managed in his life thus far. She had also begun, even more carefully, to assist the 2 children of a freedman named Samuel Cole, who had a small homestead plot about 2 miles south of the Garrett Ranch. Samuel Cole had approached her with his hat in his hands one morning in early June, having heard from someone that there was a woman at the Garrett place who knew teaching, and asked if she could spare any time for his children. She had said yes without hesitation. This became known in Caldwell. Cora Blanchard's network of information was remarkable in its reach, and within 3 weeks of Eliza beginning these lessons, word had come back to the council that the Doyle woman was at it again, teaching colored children on the frontier the same as she had done in Wichita. The council sent a more formal communication this time, a letter delivered by the sheriff, signed by Gerald Blanchard as council chairman, stating that Eliza Doyle's employment at the Garrett Ranch was being investigated as a violation of community standards, and that the council reserved the right to take further action. It was, as Eliza and Jeremiah both recognized, a threat with no actual legal teeth, but the intention of making life difficult enough that she would leave of her own accord. Jeremiah read the letter at the kitchen table while she watched. When he finished, he set it down, squared it with the edge of the table with one careful motion, and said, "Write a response." "What kind of response?" "A letter to every member of the town council, including the Reverend, and a copy to the county sheriff in Sumner County, and a copy to the newspaper in Wichita, stating clearly what you are doing, why you are doing it, and that it is lawful, and that any attempt to interfere with it will be documented. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. That is an aggressive response. Yes, he said, but a polite one. Cora Blanchard has been doing what she does for 15 years in this town because nobody has ever pushed back with more force than a complaint. She works on the assumption that she can outlast people. I think it is time someone demonstrated that she cannot outlast this. The letters were written that afternoon. Eliza drafted them and Jeremiah reviewed them, and they were both satisfied with the result. They were formal, precise, factual, and entirely without heat, which made them more effective than anger would have. They were sent on the morning stage to Wichita. The response was slow, but it came. The newspaper in Wichita ran a small item about the situation in Caldwell, framed as a question of local governance and community rights that was not unflattering to Eliza's position. The county sheriff sent a letter to Gerald Blanchard asking for clarification of the legal basis for the council's actions. The Reverend, who had apparently been waiting for something to shift the balance, announced from his pulpit on the following Sunday that the teaching of reading and writing to any willing student regardless of their origin was a Christian act, and that the Caldwell Council might do well to remember what values the community was supposed to represent. It was not a revolution, but it was enough. Gerald Blanchard was a man who cared about his reputation in the broader county, and when the broader county began to look at what the council had been doing, he found himself less willing to carry Cora's water. The formal letter was retracted not with apology, but with a brief notification that the matter had been reviewed and no further action would be taken. Cora was furious, but even Cora understood when a fight was costing more than it was worth. On the evening the retraction arrived, Eliza sat on the porch with her hands in her lap and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was clenched. She breathed out slowly and watched the last light color the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Jeremiah came out and sat beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the way of people who have been through something together and do not need to discuss every part of it. "She will not stop entirely," Eliza said finally. "She is the kind of person who does not stop. She will just wait and look for another angle." "Probably," he agreed. "But she has lost something today. She has lost the automatic assumption that nobody will fight back. That is a significant loss for someone like her." "How do you know so much about someone like her?" Eliza asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a moment. "My father dealt with a man like that. Different form, same structure. Man who believed he had the right to decide what everyone around him was allowed to do, and who used every tool available, legal and otherwise, to enforce that belief. My father fought him for 11 years, lost some rounds and won some rounds, and eventually just outlasted him." He paused. "He told me once that the most important thing about fighting that kind of person is that you have to be willing to still be there when they get tired. They always get tired eventually. Most good people give up first." "Your father sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "He was," Jeremiah said, and there was a quiet grief in the past tense that she heard and did not push. The summer deepened, and something else deepened alongside it. She and Jeremiah had fallen into a rhythm that was, she recognized, more than professional. They worked together with the ease of people who understand each other's thinking. They argued sometimes, not badly but genuinely, about how things on the ranch should be managed, and she had learned that he was a man who could lose an argument gracefully, which she found attractive in the way that goodness of character is always attractive. He had learned that she was a woman who would not change her opinion unless given a reason, and that when she changed it completely and without defensiveness. There was, she noticed, a quality to the evenings on the porch that had changed without either of them naming it. There was a warmth to the silence between them that felt different from the early weeks. He sat closer than he had before, not in any way that was forward or assuming, just in the way of someone who has grown comfortable with proximity. She found that she arranged herself in her chair to be turned slightly toward him rather than away. One evening in early August, during a thunderstorm that rolled in off the prairie with extraordinary speed and turned the sky green and then purple and brought rain in sheets against the windows, they ended up in the parlor together, she reading, he working on a harness repair, and the lamp threw warm light across the room, and the storm made the house feel like a different world from the one outside, and she looked up from her book and found him looking at her. He did not look away when she caught him looking. He just held her gaze with an expression that she could finally read without ambiguity. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something he is not sure he has the right to set down. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, and she did not mean it as a response to her name, and they both knew it. He set the harness down on the floor. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he chose everything. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that your answer will not change anything about your position here. I need you to understand that first." "I understand it," she said. "I'm not certain when this happened," he said, "because I am not particularly good at tracking the interior of my own experience. But I have reached a point where the idea of you leaving this place is something I cannot think about without something that feels very much like panic. And that is new for me. I have not felt that before about anything except the ranch itself, and that is an entirely different kind of thing." He stopped. "I am not saying that very well." "You are saying it well enough," she said, and her heart was doing something loud and inconvenient in her chest. "I would like to court you," he said, "if that is something you would be willing to consider. Properly and honestly, and with full acknowledgement that I understand your independence is not a problem to be solved, but a quality I admire." She looked at him across the warm, lamplit room while the storm pressed against the windows. She thought about all the reasons why this was complicated. She thought about the employment situation and the imbalance of power in it. She thought about Cora Blanchard, who would find this news and try to use it somehow. She thought about how much she had come to value her position here, and how afraid she was of that being changed. And then she thought about the evenings on the porch, and the way he had spoken to her when she talked about Thomas Reeves's children, and the look in his eyes when the fever had broken on Walt's forehead, and the absolute simplicity and steadiness of the man sitting across from her in the lamplight. "I would be willing to consider it," she said. He exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale, but it was deeply felt, the exhale of someone who has been carrying tension and has just been allowed to release it. He nodded once slowly, and she saw something in his face open up in a way that made him look younger and considerably less armored than usual. "Good," he said. "That is good." "It is complicated," she said. "Most worthwhile things are," he said. She laughed, which she had not expected to do, and his answering smile was the full version of the thing she had only seen glimpses of before, and it transformed his face entirely and made her feel warm from her sternum outward. The courtship was, by necessity, quiet and careful. They were, after all, already living and working in the same space, which meant that the courtship had to happen in the texture of daily life, rather than in the formal visiting rituals that a more ordinary situation would have allowed. He would find reasons to be near her that were plausible on their surface, coming to the kitchen to check on something, pausing at the garden gate when she was weeding. She would find reasons to consult him about account decisions that she could have made perfectly well on her own. But there were also times when they stopped pretending the reasons were practical. One evening he came to find her where she was sitting on the south side of the house in the late afternoon shade reading a letter from Mabel, and he sat down in the grass beside her chair, not a chair himself, just the grass, the way a man sits outside when he is not being formal about it, and said, "Tell me something about who you were before Kansas." She told him about her father's farm, about the particular quality of early mornings before everything went wrong, about learning to read from a Methodist minister who had a traveling library in his wagon and came through Abilene twice a year and left her 3 books when she was 12. She told him about the loss of the farm, which she described factually but which still carried weight in her voice. She told him about Wichita and the schoolteacher whose assistant she had been, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, no relation to the town, who had been a genuine mentor and who had wept when Eliza was dismissed. She told him about Thomas Reeves and his children, whose names were Marcus and Eli, and a daughter named Pearl, and she said their names with the care you give to the names of people who mattered. He listened to all of it. He asked questions at the right moments and was silent at the right moments. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, looking out across the grass, and then he said, "You have been running against the grain for a long time." "Running against someone else's grain," she said. "Going with my own." "Yes," he said. "That is a better way to put it." He reached over and touched the back of her hand briefly, just once, and she turned her hand over, and they sat like that for a while in the afternoon light, and neither of them said anything, and it was enough. In September, Mabel Greer's health began to decline. Her arthritis had been worsening through the summer, and in early September she wrote to Eliza to say that she was going to have to close the seamstress shop. She was 60 years old and her hands could no longer manage the fine work, and she had received an offer from her niece in Topeka to come and live with her family there. She was going to take it. Eliza rode into town to see her, and they sat together in the back room of the shop, one last time with the bolts of fabric around them and the tools of Mabel's trade. And Mabel held her sore hands in her lap and looked at Eliza with the clear eyes of someone who has made her peace with a difficult decision. "You are going to be all right," Mabel said. "Better than all right, I think." "I hope so," Eliza said. "I know so," Mabel said. "I have known Jeremiah Garrett for 10 years. He is not a man who does things halfway, and he is not a man who has ever looked at a woman the way he looks at you." She smiled at Eliza's expression. "I have eyes, even if my hands are giving out." Eliza helped Mabel pack and saw her onto the northbound stage in late September, and the farewell was difficult in the particular way of losing someone who had been a lighthouse when you were lost at sea. She stood and watched the stage until the dust swallowed it, and then she wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and turned back toward where she had hitched her horse. She was riding a proper horse now, a calm bay mare named Clara that Jeremiah had assigned to her use, and found that Jeremiah had ridden in and was standing beside Clara with his hat in his hand, having somehow known that she would need someone to be there. She walked to him and he looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said nothing, just stood beside her, and she leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder and allowed herself 30 seconds of grief before she straightened and breathed in and became herself again. "She will be fine in Topeka," she said. "She will," he agreed. He helped her onto Clara without being asked, which he would not normally have done because he knew she preferred to manage for herself, and she accepted it this once because sometimes you accept help. They rode back to the ranch together in the September afternoon light, side by side on the road through the grass, and she was intensely aware of him beside her and intensely grateful for his presence in a way that had become, she acknowledged to herself, completely irreversible. She was in love with him. She had been for some time, probably since July, possibly since that evening when he had looked at her across the kitchen and said, "Long enough," in answer to her question about how he could know what kind of person she was. She was in love with him with the particular clarity of a person who does not fall easily or carelessly, and who therefore, when they do fall, falls with absolute conviction. She had not yet told him this. She was not sure how or when to do it, and she was also slightly afraid of it, not because she doubted her own feeling, but because the depth of it was more than she had expected to feel for anyone, and that made it frightening in the way that important things are frightening. He told her first. It was an October evening, one of those Kansas evenings that comes before the real cold sets in, when the air has a bite to it but the sunset is extraordinary, all orange and deep red and purple along the western horizon. They were on the porch, as they often were, and she was mending a shirt for Walt who had caught his sleeve on a fence nail, and Jeremiah had his elbows on the porch rail, and was watching the sunset with the focused attention he gave to landscapes. He turned around and looked at her and said, I love you, just like that. No preamble, no particular build-up, just the statement, clear and direct as everything else he said. She set down the shirt very carefully in her lap. Her hands were slightly unsteady. "I'm not saying it because I expect anything from it," he said. "I am saying it because it is true and because I think true things should be said." She looked at him. In the last of the sunset light he was very himself, the strong line of him, the directness, the particular quality of his stillness that had nothing passive in it. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time." The silence that followed was full of something that she could only describe as arrival, the feeling of reaching a place you have been traveling toward without knowing it. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and sat down beside her on the bench and took her hand in both of his carefully, as if it were something worth being careful with. She looked down at their hands together, her small capable ones and his scarred and work-roughened ones, and felt a happiness that was very quiet and very deep and absolutely certain. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I will not ask you tonight because I want you to have had time to think about it before I ask. I want it to be a decision and not a reaction." She laughed again. He had a quality of surprising her into laughter. "You are possibly the most deliberate man I have ever met." "I am aware of it," he said, with that rare full smile that still managed to surprise her. "Is it intolerable?" "It is the opposite of intolerable," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, very gently, with his dark eyes on her face, and she felt that touch everywhere. They sat together until the sunset finished and the stars came out, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and he did not move or speak, and neither did she. And the night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, and it was enough, and more than enough, and entirely right. He asked her properly 2 weeks later. He did it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, which was the one day a week that was slow and unhurried, with coffee between them and the autumn light coming through the window. He had clearly thought about it for the entire 2 weeks, because he had things to say about what he could offer her, which he described practically and without false modesty, and about what he hoped for, which he described with the careful honesty of someone who has not spoken his interior life aloud very often and is making an effort to do it now. He said that he hoped they would work the ranch together and that it would grow over time. He said that he hoped they would have children if that was what she wanted. He said that he understood she was a woman who needed room to be fully herself and that he would never ask her to be smaller than she was. She let him finish. Then she said, "Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Yes, yes," she said again, because it felt worth saying twice. The wedding took place in November, officiated by Reverend Aldous in the little white church that had gotten a fresh coat of paint since the summer. It was a small affair. Eliza had nobody to invite from her previous life except for the memory of Mabel, who sent a letter with her blessing. Jeremiah's side of the church held his 3 ranch hands, Walt and Rodrigo and Pete, who had all cleaned themselves up to a remarkable degree for the occasion, and 2 neighboring ranching families who had known Jeremiah for years, the Harpers and the McClendons, solid people who shook Eliza's hand with the warmth of people genuinely glad to see a good man find a good woman. Samuel Cole and his children came to stand outside the church, because the year being 1878 in Kansas, the church's congregation would not have easily accommodated them inside, and Eliza thought about this injustice with a hot, tight feeling in her chest even on her wedding day. But she went out to them before the ceremony and embraced Samuel Cole's wife, a dignified woman named Grace, and told Marcus and Eli and Pearl that they were her special guests, and they beamed at her with the pure, uncalculated happiness of children who know when they are loved. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Mabel had sent from Topeka, a deep blue wool that Mabel said brought out the green of her eyes, and Mabel had been right as she generally was. She wore her hair up in a way that left a few curls at her temples, not because she was vain, but because Mabel had told her she should, and Mabel had earned the right to that opinion. Jeremiah wore his best clothes, which were still clearly the clothes of a working man, but clean and pressed and carrying the particular dignity of a man who has made himself what he is. He looked at her when she came down the aisle. It was a short aisle. It was a small church with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who is seeing what he wanted most and cannot quite believe it is real. They exchanged simple vows. No flourishes. The Reverend asked if they would love and honor each other, and they said yes, and meant it in the full technical and emotional weight of the word. When Reverend Aldous said he could kiss his bride, Jeremiah took her face in his careful hands and kissed her with a gentleness that was also completely certain, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and Walt made an embarrassing noise from the third pew that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed sob, and Pete elbowed him, and Rodrigo grinned. The celebration afterward was modest by most standards and wonderful by every standard that mattered. There was food provided by the Harper and Mac Clendon wives, who were excellent cooks and had brought enough to feed twice the assembly. There was music from a fiddle that Rodrigo turned out to play with surprising skill, and dancing on the frozen ground outside the church because the church itself was too small, and the day was cold but clear and nobody minded. Eliza danced with her husband, that word husband, still catching in her mind with a pleased surprise every time she thought it, and with Walt and Pete and Rodrigo, and with Mr. Harper, and with Samuel Cole, who danced with dignified precision and told her that she was a blessing to this part of the country. She thought again of the notice 3 days to leave, of the sheriff at her hotel room door, of the road out of town that she had been facing with 7 cents and a borrowed mule. She thought of Cora Blanchard, who had not attended and whose absence was a kind of presence, and she thought that Cora had wanted to erase her from this place, and had instead, through her own overreach, set in motion the sequence of events that had brought Eliza here, dancing on frozen Kansas ground with people who had become her people. There is a particular justice in that, she thought, a small but real one. The winter on the ranch was the first Eliza had spent in a place that felt like home since she was a child on her father's farm, before everything went wrong. The cold came in hard in December, and the work contracted around the essential tasks, keeping the livestock fed and watered, keeping the buildings repaired against the weather, keeping the household warm and stocked. The days were short and the evenings were long, and she and Jeremiah found, to neither of their surprise, that they were very well suited to close quarters. They read together in the evenings, side by side near the stove. He was working through a history of the Pacific Railroad that he found fascinating and she found moderately interesting, and she was reading a collected volume of George Eliot's works that she had found at the back of Mabel's shop and taken with Mabel's blessing, and sometimes they would read aloud to each other, which was a practice she had not had since childhood and which she discovered she loved. He was, she found, a tender husband. Not demonstratively so. He was still the deliberate, quiet man she had known from the first day, but tenderness was present in everything he did, in the way he always had coffee ready before she woke because he woke earlier, in the way he noticed when she was tired before she said so, in the way he reached for her hand sometimes in no particular moment, just because. She was not used to being looked after by anyone. She had been looking after herself for too long, and she found that she had to actively allow it, to resist the reflex to manage everything alone. She was learning that allowing care was its own kind of strength. In the new year of 1879, Cora Blanchard left Caldwell. It emerged over the course of several weeks that Gerald Blanchard had made some severe financial errors in his cattle operation, overextended himself on land purchases, and been caught by a drop in beef prices, and the family was selling their Caldwell holdings and relocating to Wichita, where Gerald had family who could help stabilize their finances. The departure was not dramatic on the surface, but everyone in Caldwell knew what it meant. The force that had shaped the social and political life of the town for a decade and a half was leaving. The town felt different without her. not transformed overnight, because the attitudes that Cora had cultivated in people did not leave with her, but different in the specific way that a room feels different when the dominating piece of furniture is removed. There was space where there had been none, and people were not quite sure yet what to do with it. Eliza, for her part, chose not to feel triumphant about it. She recognized that the departure of one woman did not fix the underlying conditions that had allowed her to operate as she had, and that celebrating Cora's misfortune, which was genuinely not Eliza's doing anyway, would be small. What she felt instead was a cautious opening, a sense of room. She went to see Reverend Aldous in January and had a long conversation with him about the school, which had been without a teacher for almost a year now. She presented a proposal. She would teach, but she would teach with an enrollment policy that did not exclude students on the basis of race or origin. She put this plainly and without apology. She said she understood that this was not what the previous school had done, and that it would require a change in practice and potentially in attitude from some families. The Reverend, to his credit, had been doing some thinking of his own over the preceding months. He said he thought the proposal had merit and that he would bring it to the school board, which now had 2 new members following the reorganization of the town council after the Blanchard departures, and that he believed there was a reasonable chance of approval. He was right. The vote came in February, 3-2 in favor, and Eliza Doyle Garrett became the schoolteacher of Caldwell, Kansas, beginning with the spring term. On the morning she first walked into the schoolhouse, a one-room building that smelled of chalk and old wood and the particular hope of learning, she stood for a moment in the middle of the empty room with dust motes turning in the winter light and felt the full weight and wonder of it. She thought about all the roads that had led here. She thought about the dismissed position in Wichita, the borrowed mule, the hotel room, the 3-day notice. She thought about Jeremiah Garrett coming into Mabel's seamstress shop with his hat in his hands, and an offer she had been wise enough to accept. She straightened her spine and began to arrange the room for teaching. The school opened in March to 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13. Among them were Marcus and Eli Cole, Samuel's boys, and Pearl Cole, their sister, who was 7 years old and who arrived on the first morning in a clean dress with her hair in 2 careful braids, and an expression of fierce, concentrated intention that made Eliza want to weep with gladness. Among them was also the child of a family named Dirksen, who had been openly skeptical of the new enrollment policy. And when that child arrived on the first day, alongside the Cole children, and sat down at the same bench without the sky falling, something shifted in the room that was quiet and significant. Not every family was happy. 2 families refused to enroll their children in the first term, but 8 of the 12 students continued through the spring, and by May, one of the holdout families reconsidered when their daughter, who was 11 and desperate for education, argued so persistently with her parents that they finally relented. Jeremiah rode the 3 miles from the ranch to the school on the first day and stood in the doorway for a moment before the children arrived, watching his wife set up the chalkboard. She turned and saw him and smiled. "You are going to be extraordinary at this," he said. "I am going to be entirely adequate," she said, "and that is all any teacher ever is on the first day. Extraordinary comes later, if at all." He crossed the room and kissed her, which was a brief and warm and entirely confident gesture, and then went back to the ranch because cattle do not take days off for sentimentality. She was, as it turned out, better than entirely adequate. Spring became summer, and Eliza discovered that she was pregnant in May, which she calculated from uncertain dates meant a baby due in December or perhaps January. She told Jeremiah in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting across the table from him the same way they had sat across from each other on that first afternoon when he had offered her the position. His face did something she had not seen it do before. It went through surprise, and then a kind of awe, and then something so open and happy that it almost undid her composure entirely. "December," he said. "Or January," she said. "I am not entirely certain." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she could feel that the hand was not entirely steady, which moved her more than any speech could have. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise fine. You will tell me if that changes." "I will tell you," she promised. The summer of 1879 was the fullest summer of Eliza's life. She taught school through May and June and closed for the season in July when the heat made the schoolhouse impractical, and she spent July and August on the ranch with the comfortable, solid work of it around her and Jeremiah beside her. The pregnancy was generally uncomplicated, though the August heat was a different kind of difficulty than she had experienced before, and she learned to work in the early mornings and the evenings and rest in the middle of the day, which went against every instinct she had but which she managed. Walt had appointed himself, without anyone asking him to, as a sort of unofficial guardian of her well-being during this period. He appeared regularly at the kitchen door with offerings, a bucket of well water because he thought she might need it, some particularly good firewood because he wanted to make sure she was not lifting heavy things, an extra candle because the evenings were getting shorter and he thought she might be reading. He was entirely gruff about all of it and would accept no acknowledgement that he was doing anything unusual, which was exactly right and which she respected completely. Rodrigo's English had improved enormously over the months of informal lessons, and he was teaching her Spanish in return, which she found she had a genuine aptitude for. They conducted portions of their daily interactions in alternating languages, which Pete found baffling and slightly suspicious, but Pete had grown considerably from the man he had been the previous year and kept most of his bafflement to himself. September brought the new school term. October brought the harvest and the particular satisfaction of a vegetable garden that had been genuinely productive. Jars of preserved vegetables lined up in the cellar in a row that represented real abundance. November brought the cold and the shortening days, and the particular anticipation of a house waiting for something important. The baby came on a Tuesday in the middle of December, in a snowstorm that made the world outside the windows white and muffled and still. Jeremiah had ridden out early that morning to fetch Mrs. McClendon, who had delivered every baby in a 20-mile radius for the past 15 years, and he had gotten back with her just in time. The labor was long but not complicated, and Eliza worked through it with the same focused competence she brought to everything, which was less graceful than she would have preferred but effective. The baby was a boy. He arrived in the early afternoon, red-faced and immediately forceful in his opinions about the world, and the midwife held him up and said, "A fine boy," with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done this many times and still means it every time. Jeremiah was allowed in then, and he came and sat beside Eliza on the bed, and she put their son in his arms, and the expression on Jeremiah Garrett's face at that moment was not something she had words for and not something she needed words for. It was simply the thing itself. They named him Thomas James Garrett. Thomas for Thomas Reeves, the man in Wichita whose children Eliza had taught, and for whose sake she had lost her position and ultimately found her way to Caldwell. James for Jeremiah's father, whose long fight against a powerful man had ended in the stubbornness of endurance that his son had inherited. When they told Walt the baby's name, the old man stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and cleared his throat several times before he managed to say it was a good name, and then he went back to the bunkhouse, and everyone agreed not to mention whatever had happened to his eyes. The winter was cold and full and wonderful. Thomas was a strong baby with clear opinions and a voice that carried impressively for his size. Jeremiah held him in the evenings with the baby against his chest and Eliza beside him, and they sat together by the stove and read and talked, and the baby slept, and sometimes did not sleep, and it was exactly what life should be. In the spring of 1880, Samuel Cole brought his family to church in Caldwell for the first time. They sat in the last pew, because the atmosphere in Caldwell had changed, but it had not changed entirely, and the practical reality of where comfort allowed was still what it was. But they sat there, and Reverend Aldous preached on the parable of the Good Samaritan with a specificity that suggested he had given the application some thought, and nobody walked out. That was not justice, Eliza thought, watching from her pew with Thomas on her knee. It was a very small step in the direction of justice. But small steps in the right direction, taken consistently, are how things change. Her father had never believed that, which was one of the ways in which she had decided to be different from him. Jeremiah believed it, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. After church, she stood outside with Grace Cole while their children played in the churchyard, Marcus and Eli serious and careful in their Sunday clothes, Pearl laughing at something young Walt Jr., the name Pete had given to a barn kitten that had somehow become the communal pet of the entire ranch, had done. Thomas was in his father's arms, looking at the world with the particular intensity of a baby who has recently discovered it has more dimensions than he had previously suspected. "How are the children progressing?" Grace Cole asked, nodding toward Marcus and Eli and Pearl. "Extraordinarily," Eliza said, and she meant it without qualification. "Marcus is reading at a level that would embarrass most children twice his age. Eli has a gift for numbers that I have never seen in someone so young. And Pearl," she paused and smiled, "Pearl is going to be a teacher. She already corrects the other students when they make errors. Very politely, but with absolute certainty." Grace Cole's face held a complicated happiness that Eliza understood was the happiness of a parent seeing the future open for their child in a way that had not been guaranteed. "We are grateful to you," Grace said. "Do not be grateful to me," Eliza said. "Your children did the work, I just gave them the room." The summer of 1880 was a good year for the ranch. The cattle market had steadied, and the garret operation, now more efficiently managed than it had been in its previous incarnation, was turning a real profit. Jeremiah invested some of it in improvements: a larger barn, a better pump for the well, additional grazing land from a neighbor who had decided to move his family to Colorado. He consulted Eliza on every significant decision, not as a formality but because he genuinely valued her judgment, and she brought to those conversations the same precision she brought to the account books. They were, she understood by now, one of those rare partnerships that worked in every dimension: practical, intellectual, emotional. She had not expected this when she arrived in Caldwell on her borrowed mule. She had not, if she was honest, ever expected it. She had expected to work hard and live decently and manage. The fullness of what she had instead was something she held with a grateful kind of wonder. In the fall of that year, she discovered she was pregnant again. She told Jeremiah on a Sunday morning again, at the kitchen table again, and he actually laughed out loud, which was rare and wonderful, and then came around the table and pulled her up and held her and said something into her hair that she did not quite catch but understood to be happiness. Thomas was 11 months old and already pulling himself up on furniture and looking at the world with the expression of someone who has places to be, and the thought of a sibling for him and another child in this house was overwhelming and exactly right. The second baby came in June of 1881, a girl this time, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, and the lungs of someone who intended to be heard. They named her Margaret Rose for no reason except that it was a beautiful name, and it was June, and the roses that Eliza had planted against the south side of the house the previous spring were just coming into bloom, and it seemed right. Jeremiah held her in the June evening light with Thomas pressed against his knee trying to see this new person, and Eliza watched them from the bed where the midwife had installed her with strict instructions to rest, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing I never knew I was headed toward." The years that followed built on each other the way good things do, not always easily, not without difficulty or grief, or the ordinary frustrations of work and weather and human imperfection, but with the particular accumulation of a life that has direction and love and purpose in it. The school grew. By 1882, there were 22 students enrolled, and by 1883, Eliza needed an assistant. She trained the assistant herself, a young woman named Harriet Benson from a farm family south of town, and found that she was a natural teacher of teachers. Marcus Cole, who was 14 by then and reading everything he could get his hands on, began to ask her seriously about the possibility of further education, and Eliza began to investigate what was possible, writing letters to institutions in Topeka and Kansas City on his behalf with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. The ranch hands changed over the years in the natural way of working life. Pete eventually moved on to a cattle operation in Texas, and they parted well. Rodrigo married a woman named Consuela from the Mexican community to the south and brought her to live on the ranch, which added another dimension of life to the place and which Eliza was genuinely glad of. Walt stayed because Walt was the kind of man who stays. He was more family than employee by now, and everyone understood it, and nobody felt the need to say so. Caldwell itself changed too. Not completely, and not without ongoing struggle. The injustices that Eliza had encountered in 1878 did not vanish, because they were not simply the product of one powerful woman, but of deeper structures that required longer effort. But things changed. The school held. Marcus Cole went to Topeka in 1884 at the age of 15, with a letter of recommendation from Eliza and a determination that was terrifying in its quality, and was accepted into a preparatory school program there. Pearl Cole, at 10, was already the best student in the classroom by a considerable margin. Cora Blanchard and Gerald Blanchard remained in Wichita and were not heard from in Caldwell. Gerald rebuilt his finances slowly and modestly. Cora was, by all accounts that reached Caldwell, perfectly willing to manage a smaller territory. In the spring of 1883, on a warm April evening when the prairie was green and the cottonwoods along the south side of the house were fully leafed out and throwing long afternoon shadows across the yard, Eliza sat on the porch with Thomas, who was 3.5, and had recently developed strong opinions about beetles, and Margaret, who was not quite 2, and was asleep in the basket beside her mother's chair, with the absolute conviction of the very young that the world will hold still long enough for a nap. Jeremiah came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came up onto the porch and stopped for a moment, looking at the three of them in the late light, his wife in her chair with her braid slightly loose from the day, and a small person fascinated by beetles on her lap and another small person asleep in a basket. And he had the same expression he had worn on their wedding day, the one she had decided she would remember for the rest of her life. He sat down beside her, and Thomas immediately transferred his beetle and his opinions to his father, who received both with patience and genuine interest. And Eliza rested her head back against her chair and watched her husband explain beetle anatomy to their son with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything. And the evening light lay golden across the porch, and somewhere out across the grass a meadowlark was singing. She thought about 3 days. About the particular specific 3 days that had started everything: the notice in the hotel room, the road out of town, the borrowed mule and 7 cents. She thought about what those 3 days would have been if she had not walked into Mabel's shop, if Mabel had not said her name with that particular deliberateness, if Jeremiah Garrett had not been a man who showed up when something was wrong and offered the specific thing that was needed. She thought about how close the alternative had been: the road, the nothing, the next town and the continuous motion of a person who has no place to stop. She was stopped now. She was stopped and rooted and growing. "What are you thinking about?" Jeremiah asked. Thomas had transferred his attention from beetles to a piece of fence railing and was examining it with equal intensity. 1878, she said. He looked at her with the directness she had known since the beginning, that quality of really looking. Specifically, the mule, she said, the 7 cents, the road. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes too," he said. "About whether you would have stayed if I had not. You changed the terms of the situation," she said. "You gave me a way to stay that did not require me to surrender anything. That is not a small thing." She paused. "That is actually everything." He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her hand over in the way she had learned to do, the way that meant she was receiving as well as giving. Margaret stirred in the basket, made a small sound, settled again. Thomas abandoned the fence railing and came to lean against his father's knee and look up at both of his parents with the solemn, assessing gaze of a child who is trying to understand the world. "She is going to wake up hungry in about 20 minutes, Eliza said. "I know," Jeremiah said. "I can hear it coming. The fence on the north pasture needs attention. The corner post is soft." "I know," he said again. "Rodrigo and I will see to it tomorrow. Walt's knee has been bothering him. He should not be doing heavy lifting." "I know," he said, and there was a smile in his voice, the smile that had always surprised her and still did. "I know all of this. I am keeping track." She laughed softly so as not to wake Margaret. "I know you are. Stop managing for 10 minutes, he said. "The ranch will survive 10 minutes. She looked at him. The sun was going down behind the western horizon, and the sky above it was doing its Kansas thing, which was to be too big and too beautiful for any single human to take in all at once. The meadowlark was still singing. Thomas had fallen asleep against Jeremiah's knee with the speed of a child who decides without announcement to simply stop being awake. She leaned into her husband's shoulder and was quiet. The prairie spread out from the porch in every direction, enormous and alive and permanent in the way of the land that outlasts everything built on it. The Garrett Ranch sat on the edge of Caldwell the way it always had, 1 mile east of the town, close enough to be part of the life of the community and set apart enough to have its own character, its own rhythms, its own quiet authority. It was hers. Not in the legal sense that the year of 1878 allowed for in Kansas, where married women's property rights were still being sorted out by legislators who were slower than they should have been, but in the sense that mattered, in the sense that she had shaped it and it had shaped her, and the two things were now inseparable. Her garden was in the ground. Her students were in the schoolroom. Her husband's hand was in hers. Her children were asleep in the last of the evening light. She had arrived in Caldwell with nothing but competence and conviction, and the town had said she was not welcome, and one man at the edge of town had looked at that verdict and said no, quietly and absolutely, and here she was 5 years later, rooted in this ground like the cottonwoods along the south wall, which were now tall enough to shade the porch in the summer afternoons, and which would outlast everything else on the property by 100 years. Margaret woke. It was, as predicted, approximately 20 minutes. Eliza got up and lifted her daughter out of the basket and held her against her chest, and the baby grumbled at being awake, and then decided to be awake and looked at her mother with Jeremiah's eyes. "Hello," Eliza said. Margaret said something that was not yet a word but had the strong conviction of one. "Fair enough," Eliza said, and smiled and carried her inside. Jeremiah sat a moment longer on the porch with Thomas asleep against his leg, and the last of the sunset dying, and the stars beginning to appear. He could hear his wife in the kitchen, moving with the comfortable competence of a person in their own space, and the sound of her voice talking to Margaret in the low, easy tone she used with small things, and the particular domestic music of it filled the ranch house from the inside out. He thought about the day he had walked into Mabel Greer's shop and seen a woman with auburn hair and green eyes sitting with a piece of sewing in her lap, looking up at him with clear and level assessment and no particular tendency to be impressed by anything she had not yet been given reason to find impressive. He thought about the quality of courage that was not dramatic but was simply structural, the kind that shows up in how a person lives from day to day, in what they refuse to sacrifice, in what they do when nobody is looking and there is no reward for doing it. He had known from the first conversation that she was that kind of person. He had not expected to fall so thoroughly in love with her. He had expected to offer her something, to do a right thing in the face of a wrong one, and then to carry on with the manageable life he had built. He had not expected her to become the best part of it. He was grateful every day in the quiet structural way that real gratitude works, not as an emotion that comes and goes, but as a permanent orientation, a way of understanding what he had. Thomas made a sound in his sleep. Jeremiah put his hand on his son's back and felt the small, sturdy warmth of him. Inside, Margaret had decided she was hungry and was communicating this with impressive volume. He smiled and picked up his sleeping son and went inside. The prairie behind him lay in the full dark now, wide and quiet, and full of its own ongoing life. The light in the Garrett Ranch windows was warm against it, the particular warm gold of lamplight in a house that is not just a building but a home that had been made, deliberately and with care and with love, by two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, and had been, both of them, brave enough to hold on.